trying to let the folks know.
Call the September 23rd, 2019 meeting of the Portsmouth City Council to order. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Battle.
Here.
Mr. Clark.
Here.
Mr. Glover.
Here.
Mrs. Lucasberg. Here. Mr. Moody. Ms. Simmons. Here. Mayor Rowe.
Here. I ask everybody to put their phones on silence, vibrate. We have a need to go into closed session first, and then we'll come out, do the certification, and then we go into the council chamber.
Yes, sir.
For the presentation.
Okay.
Is there a motion to go into closed session?
I move to go into closed meeting pursuant to Virginia Code subsection 2.2-3711A.1 for the purpose of interviewing, discussing, and considering prospective candidates for and appointees to boards and commissions.
Second.
We have a motion that's been duly named and seconded. Any discussion? Madam Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Battle. Mr. Clark.
Yes.
Mr. Glover.
Yes.
Mrs. Lucasberg.
Yes.
Mr. Moody is absent. Ms. Simmons.
Yes.
Mayor Rowe.
Yes, we're in closed session. I'll try again. I call council back in order, and I thank you all for coming tonight. This is a work session of City Council. Thank you for your indulgence. We had interviews for possible appointments to boards and commissions tonight. And again, we felt that this venue, the council chamber, would be the best place to hear the report. And so with that, I'll ask our Deputy City Manager, LaVorce Pace, if you will present our next item.
Thank you, Mayor. Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council, and assembled guests, good evening. In February 2017, the City Council, at its annual retreat, identified the issue of poverty as a priority and proposed the establishment of a poverty task force council to work on many complex issues surrounding poverty in Portsmouth. Dr. Melvina T. Sumter with Old Dominion University's Sociology and Criminal Justice Department began initial work with the city on poverty issues, initially focusing on education, and her work continues today. In February 2018, the City of Portsmouth began work with the consulting firm Thomas P. Miller and Associates to conduct a broad study of poverty in Portsmouth, including the use of extensive outreach efforts with community members and stakeholders. The poverty study is now complete, and tonight, Ms. Emily Kraus, project manager with Thompson P. Miller and Associates, will present an overview of the findings and recommendations, as well as entertain questions from City Council. Ms. Kraus.
Does this work? Hello? You can hear me? Cool. I wanted to have free hands. I don't know why. Hello, good evening. Closer? Is that any better? Okay, I'll use the this one. Is this one on? Yes. Okay. Better? All right. Sounds good. Well, good evening. As LaVorce mentioned, my name is Emily Krauser. I am with Thomas P. Miller and Associates. We're a consulting firm based in Indianapolis, Indiana, and we work nationally on issues of workforce, economic development, community development, things like that. And we have been honored to work with you here in Portsmouth for the last year and a half, I think, on this project for the poverty study. So tonight I'm going to walk you through a little bit of the background of the poverty study, what all is in the full report, talk a little bit about the public outreach efforts that we did over the last year. I want to go through some just basics about poverty in Portsmouth that I think are important to understand as you try to tackle this issue here in the city. And then I'm going to overview the recommendations, but specifically the recommendations for City Council. There are some recommendations in the report for the task force once it gets up and running as well. And then I'll share with you some of the case studies that we used that we took specific recommendations out of, because a lot of our recommendations came from our experience as a firm, as well as from some of the research that we did, the background research for this study. First, I want to walk through what is in the full study. So we have the information in there from the public input survey and the engagement sessions that we did. I'll talk a little bit more about what that public input entailed in the next slide. We did interviews with city and service providers across the city, so both city employees and nonprofit organizations. There is a review of other studies that were completed about Portsmouth over the few years prior to our study. We didn't want to leave any of that out since there was some good data in there. We also did research on what other cities have done, what their poverty initiatives have looked like, what they learned so far from their poverty initiatives. There's research on poverty in Portsmouth, just what it looks like here. There's also recommendations, as I said, for the City Council as well as for the task force. And then we did a little bit of census-tract prioritization to show what would happen if you did some targeting of pilot programs in specific locations, what those locations might be, based on the poverty statistics that we were able to pull. So that's what's in the full report. If you have this, that's a link to the full report, but I just realized that everybody has paper copies, but that full report is available on the city's website for anyone who wants to read it. All right, so the public outreach that we did, it was really important to get public input as part of this study, and we have those findings in the report. But I wanted to talk specifically about what process we went to, and that included 2 public input forums that were open to anyone. They were advertised in the news, in the media, things like that. We went to Oasis during their feeding ministry and collected input from the people there who were taking part in that feeding ministry. We also did a focus group with the faith community. It was one of their regular meetings. They let us come in and ask questions during that. We did interviews with organizations working to alleviate poverty. On the previous slide, I talked a little bit about this. A lot of it was city employees or the heads of nonprofit organizations working to alleviate poverty. We also did a survey, a public input survey that was open to anyone who lived or worked in the city of Portsmouth. We had more than 200 responses to that survey and advertised it at some of the summer gatherings, the public summer gatherings that happened here a summer ago. So we gathered a fair amount of information from the public as part of that effort, and really got a good feel for what the public thought kind of were correlated with the issue of poverty, what were some of the things that might be important to them. And some of the main things were crime, education, and the availability of jobs that came out of that public input that people were particularly worried about in the city. All right, I'm going to move on to talk about what poverty looks like in Portsmouth. So first of all, poverty impacts more than 16,000 adults and children in the city of Portsmouth. You can see on the chart here, Norfolk actually has a little bit of a higher percentage. But Norfolk and Portsmouth are tops in the region. The Hampton Roads area is that third column on your right. And then the line going through is the US average of 13.4%. So in Portsmouth, it's 16,000 adults and children. It's 17.9%, which is a little bit more than 1 in 6. little bit more than 1 in 6 individuals in the city living in poverty. So to really kind of clarify what that means, I want to talk about the definition of poverty, which seems it can get a little bit fuzzy sometimes. So right now I'm going to talk about the federal poverty level. It's important to know that the federal poverty level is based on family size, which is to say a family is in poverty rather than specifically an individual. And so for individuals, the 2018 federal poverty level, you can see there is just over $12,000 a year. It makes sense that 2 people living in one household would cost more than 1 person living in one household, and so it goes up for each added family member. So a family of 2 meets the federal poverty level with $16,460 a year, and a family of 4 with just over $25,000 a year. And I'm sure you're seeing these numbers and realizing that this federal poverty level really is quite low, especially for the cost of living on the East Coast or anywhere in the country. So this federal poverty level is asking families of 4 to live on about $25,000 a year. So in addition to what that threshold really means when we're talking about number and percentage of people living in poverty, I also wanted to show what it looks like. So if we're talking about addressing the issue of poverty in Portsmouth, it's important to know what it looks like. How does it break down? And so this is one of my favorite ways to show how this breaks down. So of the 16,228 Portsmouth residents who are living in poverty, there are, we often think of job solutions first, workplace solutions first. And so I wanted to break down those who wouldn't necessarily be considered in that population. So if you look at the top right, 7,314 of those individuals are younger than age 18. So that's a pretty good proportion there that are younger than 18. On the top left, you can see that just under 2,000 of those individuals are ages 18 to 64, so working age, but do have an identified disability that would stop them from working or being in the workforce. They may be in the workforce, but working part-time or working at a low-wage job. And then on the bottom left, you can see there 1,653 individuals who are 65 or over. So it's not to say that they're not in the workforce, but you start expecting fewer of them to be in the workforce once they hit that threshold. So then, of course, in the bottom right then is everybody else who isn't part of those other 3 groups. So those who are 18 to 64, who are not diagnosed with a disability, and that is 33% of the population that is in poverty. So a third of the population in poverty is working age and able to work. So as you're thinking of solutions and talking about what it would look like to address poverty, I wanted to keep an eye on the fact that 2/3 of the people who are living in poverty are not necessarily working age. All right, so I'm going to move on to some of the recommendations. As I said earlier, I have 2 sets of recommendations here, one for the task force, should the task force, as it is being formed, all of the task force recommendations have a set of data around the issue area that they would address, as well as some recommendations specifically for maybe some low-hanging fruit to look at. And I won't go too far into those today because I'm here talking to City Council, and I know that there are some things that are within your purview that might be a little bit more applicable to you, but please feel free to read those task force ones as well. And just because I think it might be important for the task force, the sections that are in there that may or may not be the work groups that you end up with for the task force, there's information about education, about workforce development, about city and community service provision, and then one about crime and policing. So you can see those all in the full report. All right. So I'm going to start with the most obvious of the City Council recommendations, which is let's do a task force. That is something that I know the city has already been working on, and I think it's a good plan for moving forward, and a lot of our research hinged on what other cities were doing with task forces that were similar. So these are actually bullet points of, in order to do this task force, here are some things that we might recommend to support that task force in its charge. And I would recommend that its charge is really threefold. One is to recommend policy changes to the City Council from their area of interest or expertise. The second is to seek new funding and apply for it with their partners. And the third would be to find out any gaps in services that exist in their area of expertise. So where are there things that just aren't happening in the city? And I think within their areas of expertise, that task force might be able to identify those well. And so in order to support the task force in doing this and coming and providing feedback for the City Council and in working on the issue of poverty in the city, these are things that might be helpful to get that up and running. And one is, I know that there's already a resilience officer who is also a poverty manager in the city manager's office. So having someone as really that point person to make sure that this is running, that people are still having meetings, doing kind of the underground work to make sure it keeps moving forward, I think is really important. Also, you might request that the city manager's office annually provide a report and make a presentation about what the progress has been to date. That's something a lot of other cities have used and have found it pretty helpful to have that annual reminder of what's going on. Also, measure progress by selecting 1 to 5 data indicators to look at annually. Those data indicators don't change particularly often, and so annually is a good way to just kind of benchmark on what is happening. It might just be the poverty rate itself. You might have a couple of other indicators that you want to look at to show things like high school graduation or unemployment, to kind of show around what the issue area of poverty you're interested in. But doing that and keeping it consistent year after year would be helpful. One of the things that we saw in some of the background research is the idea of setting aside a specific budget for task force generated small pilot projects. So allowing the task forces to take on small pilot projects to see, hey, maybe this would work, and try that out, and to have a budget set aside for them to come up with something that'll work for the community. And the other is to include at least one individual on each task force subcommittee that provides direct services to low-income individuals and families, to make sure that that voice is represented and that the people who are currently doing that work are being heard, and we know about what services are currently happening and linking between those services. All right. So that is just about creating a task force, but I have a few other suggestions for the City Council that aren't around that idea, and I'm going to go through them. I chunked them. There are, I believe, 8 of them. This is number 1. I put them in a different order than they are in the full report, just because I thought it might flow better in talking. That's the only reason why they're in a different order. All right. So the second recommendation is to identify and implement policy changes that could affect poverty. This one seems very straightforward, but I think that along with the idea that task force members can recommend things to City Council, I think there are some other city departments that might also be able to come up with some good recommendations on policy changes that City Council should take into account. A few that I have here that may be under the purview of someone at the city, maybe the City Council, maybe not, are connect residents owing city debt with financial counseling because they are coming into city coffers in some way. Raise awareness about the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a really good social program that helps a fair number of individuals who are in poverty. Work with the police department and the homeless outreach task force, homeless outreach team. I think it's the homeless outreach team, who are already starting to do some of this work, who I know were asking for kind of taking a new look at what the repercussions are for loitering and other low-level disruptive behavior that they're seeing on a day-to-day basis, seeing what kinds of repercussions might have more of an impact on the lives of these individuals. All right, so the next one is to ensure that no Portsmouth City employee earns sub-poverty wages. So we do have a section of research in the full report that talks about what we were able to find in terms of wages that were being paid. The minimum Portsmouth salary, which was available to us, it's grade 8, is about equal to poverty wage for a single person living alone, which goes up, that number goes up if it's 2 people in a family, which means that probably all the people making that wage are not single people. So looking at what the wages are and how they're being paid, I know that there have been some recent efforts to try to address that with some segments of Portsmouth City employees. I think there was a teacher's one recently, as well as maybe something in the police department. But continuing to look at those, make sure that no one who works for the city of Portsmouth earns that. I know there's a lot of the employment that does exist here is government employment. And also, we took a look at just the mid-range salary for a city employee, which we took a look a little bit at living wage. I want to talk, one of the case studies that I'll tell you about in a minute actually took living wage into account into its city finances. So living wage is a bunch of researchers got together, realized that the poverty rate is actually pretty low, and it's really hard to live in some cities with that amount of money, and did some calculations to figure out what living wage would be by county across the U.S. There's a living wage cost calculator out of MIT that we like to use often, and so that's what we used here. And the living wage for a single-parent household in Portsmouth is $41,000 a year. And you don't reach that until grade 25 here in the city of Portsmouth. All right, another recommendation that we have here is to actively engage with regional partners. The city of Portsmouth is very close in location to many other cities here in the Hampton Roads area. And there's a lot that happens kind of in this regional economy that is important to how Portsmouth is able to perform. And so keep having those regional meetings, engaging actively in those regional meetings. Offer to host them here. I know there is kind of a regional feel of, we don't go to Portsmouth very often. So making some efforts to change that, to call people into community in Portsmouth. And then there are other organizations that are specifically built around the idea of a regional economy, and so engaging with those. And I've listed a couple here, but there are more. The other thing that I noticed through doing this is that it could help to strengthen the city's relationship with Portsmouth Public Schools. Making sure that you're working toward the same goals and you're both kind of having this conversation around what it means to address the things that happen with children who are living in poverty, some of the conditions that come along with that. So working with the public schools to try to address some of those and to kind of do some of that 2-generation approach where you're serving both the parents who are in need of jobs and career opportunities, as well as the youth who are trying to build to that point. And some of that is around just sharing goals. There are a lot of kind of shared values between a city and a school system, and to focus on those in order to move forward. The other thing that we thought would be helpful was just to continue working with media outlets to build a positive city narrative, to highlight the unique assets that exist within the city, to work intentionally with local and regional news outlets to talk about the things that are happening in Portsmouth, to be open and transparent about what's going on here. All right, the last two that I have here are to really increase the city's capacity to apply for state and national funds. There is a fair amount of government funding, state and national government funding, that can address social needs. And some of those are coming into Portsmouth, some of those like the Community Service Block Grant, Community Development Block Grant, things like that. But a lot of those kind of changing the focus to be around poverty alleviation could be helpful. So I also think that there are some additional funding sources out there, both state and national, that might be able to be tapped into. And this might mean hiring or repurposing or using well a grant writer or a grant manager to apply for specific poverty-related funding that does exist. And you'll see one of the appendices of the full report is a list of potential funding sources. The next one is to incorporate poverty alleviation into city funding processes. So to just kind of, it's this idea of building a narrative around poverty and all the things that are happening. And so there is, in the grant making process, in the funding process, there is an opportunity to have some of those conversations with the organizations that are funded by the city. So to discuss each program's impact on poverty when developing the annual budget, to take that into account, to take a look and make sure that a certain proportion of the annual budget is actually used on things that will alleviate poverty or that will touch the issue. It's possible to, as part of that funding process, you might want to require that anyone applying is able to talk about how their program is able to alleviate poverty or have some effect on poverty as part of that programming. So just through that funding process, there's some intentionality around making sure that some of those goals might be met, and some of that might be also incentivizing using evidence-based practice and making sure that all the programs that are funded by the city are using evidence-based practice to address the areas where they work. All right, I also wanted to talk about a couple of the case studies that we looked at that I pulled some of these recommendations from. So the first one is from Lynchburg, Virginia. And you can see here some of the details about, they created a Thriving Cities initiative. They created dedicated committees around childcare, education, food disparity, health and mental health, housing, criminal justice system, transportation. They created a lot of committees. And they also were the ones that set aside $25,000 for projects developed by the committees for them to start piloting something to show whether or not it worked in the communities. And they're currently working on projects like grocery stores, welcome backpacks, transportation app to get people to where they need to go more quickly, and to let that information out and be able to track buses and things. And so we took the recommendation there for setting aside some budget to do specific poverty alleviation work from them. We also looked into Utah. This is actually a state initiative, which was interesting. They ran it through their Department of Workforce Development, but it also included members of the Department of Human Services, because it's important to have, multiple departments working together on this sort of thing. And that commission actually guided policy and program decisions in the state. So it helped with some of those funding and policy-based issues that were coming up at the state level. And they also did a lot of support out of this commission for counties who are also taking on similar poverty alleviation efforts. We also took a look at Richmond, Virginia, and the mayor there actually established an anti-poverty commission. We looked at this because it was set up a little bit similar, because it was created out of the mayor's office. And of course, the commission provided recommendations on poverty reduction tactics to the city. The commission itself was required to file an annual report to city council. You've seen that one before. And do a presentation on the progress to date. And they also have adopted this living wage idea, this living wage model, like I talked about. They kind of had this realization that helping families, step out of poverty wasn't quite enough for them. They wanted to step into that living wage area, and took that upon themselves as a city to try to address. All right. So those were just some of the highlights of what was in the report. It is significantly more robust than I was able to get into today. But I did want to give you some of the highlights and talk through, especially the really what it means to be living in poverty in Portsmouth, and some of those recommendations specifically for City Council. So I believe I'm taking questions from the council members. Great.
Thank you so much for your presentation. And members of City Council, your questions. Okay, we'll start with Shannon. Shannon had his hand up first.
Ms. Krauser, couple of things. I looked over the proposal, and I came away with some pretty good ideas. And first of all, I want to say thank you for putting this together. One of the things that really interests me, of course, is the focus on earning the living wage. I think that's critically important. Looking at the numbers here, for example, you said that for a family of one adult supporting one child, a family would need to spend $55,000. That's for their living expenses. So that's a big thing that we need to focus on. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, in conjunction with that, workforce development, getting young people prepared for the jobs that are in our community and in our region, and getting those adults prepared, because I think it really starts there. So the question is this: in terms of what you've put together, I know we can't do everything at one time, but would you recommend, or is it your recommendation that would be a good place to start?
Thank you. I think that there is no good single place to start. Poverty is a huge issue that requires a multi-pronged approach, and it's important to do all of them simultaneously. However, yes, workforce development is incredibly important. There is a lot of crossover. You'll see in the workforce development section in the report, there's a lot of migration in and out of Portsmouth for work. A lot of people who live here work in the surrounding communities. A lot of people who live in the surrounding communities work here. And that is not unique to the region. That does happen in a lot of the other cities around. But it is important to train up, make sure that people coming out of Portsmouth schools are prepared for the workforce, be it here or somewhere nearby. And I think that there are some really good opportunities to do that. I have some recommendations in there, things like apprenticeship programs, beefing up some of the CTE programs that are in the schools, so the technical education programs and certificates that are in the schools, I think, is a really good place to look at some of those, as well as through the Regional Workforce Development Board. They have opportunities to pay for training for individuals who are looking to get back into the workforce.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you, Ms. Krauser, for your presentation. It was quite informative. And thank you for all of our citizens who are here. You're showing your interest in this as well as we are. Two of the concerns or questions that I have, one of the slides that you showed 5,600 some citizens who are not between the ages of 18 and 64 who are not disabled and out of retirement age. So if we get those back into the workforce, does that improve our percentage as a poverty level city? And then on the other hand, with the earned income tax credit, one of the jobs that I had when I was doing a lot of jobs before I got to this point, I worked at H&R Block as a tax preparer, and a lot of people do know about the earned income tax credit, but that doesn't change their poverty level. So raising that awareness, how does that impact the change in poverty level?
So the EITC doesn't necessarily change the poverty level because it's based on earnings, you're right, but it does change the experience. So when you're talking about poverty alleviation, there are kind of two different sides. There is trying to get rid of the numbers, and then there's trying to make the experience more functional, right? So there's kind of the intervention side, and then there's also the like, hey, some of the, like with a child, you can't get them into the workforce, but you might be able to take the edge off some of the day-to-day. And so the EITC does that. It kind of alleviates some of the feel that happens with it, because it gives more funding into individuals' wallets at the end of the year because it's not being taken out by taxes. And then your other question was, I had an answer to that too. Right. We did some research to see how many people were what we call working poor It was, I believe, 8.3% of the population in Portsmouth was working either full or part-time and still fell under poverty. And so it is kind of twofold. It is both raising wages of people who are working and getting people back into the workforce. And yes, because poverty is counted in families, if you can address families, that will pull not just the adults but also the children, which will have a pretty significant impact on the numbers.
Other questions by council?
In terms of the task force, I know your firm has done this a lot, right? So in terms of the task force, in addressing these concerns, is it a recommendation to have a large task force across the community with different strengths and weaknesses to bring to the table to address some of those things, or is it better to start with a smaller select group where you can manage the expectations starting out? Because I think that speaks to whether or not the level of success you desire to have can be attained. So.
Thanks. I don't think it's the size, but the dedication and getting the right people in the room. So it is kind of a mix. I'd go kind of medium-sized. Make sure that the people who are necessary to understand what is currently happening and how it can be changed or tweaked are in the room. And if you can mandate them to be in the room, even better. But you want to make sure that any meeting has grit, has teeth, and if there are too many people trying to make the decision, it just takes too long. And so the right people and not so many of them that it stalls progress.
You have recommendations for the task force. Can you share with us some of those recommendations off the top of your head, please?
Sure. So in the education field, we talked about some of those CTE programs and making sure that they're aligned with the opportunities that do exist in the area. Be it in Portsmouth or nearby, but making sure that the CTE programs align with jobs that are available. And then making as many of those linkages as possible to help shepherd people from whatever kind of training they're in into job opportunities. This overlapped a lot with workforce, talking about apprenticeship programs and ensuring working with businesses to create apprenticeship programs that allow people to get technical hands-on skills while working. We've done a fair amount of research into disconnected youth. Some people call it opportunity youth. It's those ages 16 to 24 who are neither working nor in school. And we found that it's kind of like a revolving door of being employed and then being not employed and then being employed and then not employed. And it's particularly difficult for this population to live while in a training program without actually making money, because many of them have responsibilities to their families. So we had a lot around workforce and education and making sure that those systems kind of are talking to each other and are kind of rolling into each other in a way that is beneficial to the people going through the system. We talked a little bit about crime and policing and making sure that there's a good conversation happening between the police department and the city, making sure that there are alternative ways to address issue areas that the police are seeing that might not be criminal in nature. Things like having maybe a day center for people to go to during the day so that they are not seen as loitering. Having work programs, having alternatives to, I heard a lot about panhandling as well, and so having programs that were alternative ways to give so that the community has an easy way to say, hey, yes, I care about this, I'm giving here, rather than to you who I see every day. So there have been some boxes and other things that other cities have done. So we talked a little bit about what other opportunities might be, being able to give a wider range of tools for the police officers to use when they're out there every day. And then the last section was education, workforce, crime and policing. Oh, community services, just making sure people are working together and know what each other are doing and have good referrals across, because we've also found that individuals living in poverty have a variety of different barriers to connecting with high quality education or careers that are able to step them up a ladder. And everyone's circumstances are incredibly different from everyone else's. And so making sure that those systems are linked and connected so that they can be trusted by people who are going through them.
Thank you, Ms. Krause. Any other questions by Paul?
So, Ms., you're saying that it would help against poverty if we dealt with the mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being of our citizens, and that the city government has to take a greater role in that development, and it has to teach the citizens the things they have forgotten through their development stages and make it fun for them. And also making sure that our educational system prepares them for the jobs that we'll be bringing here to meet their needs in reference to taking them out of poverty. Thank you.
Good. Well,
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think that there are some things City Council can do in regards to social emotional health and spiritual well-being, and some things that are just beyond the purview of the council. But it made me think of things like public health awareness and making sure that educational awareness and making sure that some of that outreach to the community is happening, and encouraging and incentivizing city employees to be reaching out to the community to make sure that those messages are being heard.
On the question of census tract prioritization, give me an example of what a policy initiative would be to kind of alleviate some of that, because I know in your proposal you detailed that we have certain census tracts within the city that are more impoverished than others that would require more attention.
Sure. So what we found, for those of you who haven't had the full report, is that there are about 5 census tracts where the poverty level is 44%, and when you take them out of the rest of the population, the rest of the population's poverty rate is about 15%, which is still a little bit higher than the national, but it is getting better. So to target some of the initiatives that you're trying out on one of those 5 census tracts could be beneficial. So some of these could be piloting a new program, an early education program, making sure that if you're helping fund a center or a new development or something, that is in one of those census tracts and is taking on some of the issues of poverty along with whatever it is that they're intending to be doing. And some of them might be enacting a new policy. It's the idea of trying it out first, seeing if it works specifically in that area, and maybe even targeting programming to those. I would do it through city employees, through city programs that already exist, and making sure that those are being highly targeted so that you're getting the most help to the folks who are most in need.
thank you again. And to our administrative staff, our next step is to create the task force. And so with that, let's put this on the agenda for a real upcoming meeting soon with recommendations on size and composition, not by people, but by what they bring to the task force. And we had discussed that this is a task force that we may actually put people on who don't reside in Portsmouth because we want the strength of what they bring to help us solve poverty. With that, we'll move thank you so much. And we'll move to our next agenda item, which is the bike and pedestrian plan. Are you prepared to present that here? in the conference room. Okay. With that, we'll recess for 2 minutes as council makes a transition from here to the council conference room. Thank you again for attending. We're in recess.
Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of the City Council, good evening again. The bike and pedestrian plan, the city engaged Alta Planning and Design to assist in the preparation of a citywide bike and pedestrian plan. Project data gathering and public engagement efforts are underway, including the first community meeting, which was held on July 1st at the Churchland Library. Mr. Carl Jackson, Manager of Transportation Planning, will provide a project update and timeline for completion. Mr. Jackson.
Hi, thank you very much. Good evening, Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of council. Thank you very much for allowing me to present to you this evening. I'll provide an update on the citywide bicycle and pedestrian plan. And this is a continuation of a presentation which was brought to you about a year ago, last summer, and I will give you an update on our progress thus far. So the purpose of the briefing will be to look at the purpose and need for the bicycle and pedestrian plan, to review the plan development process, and to look at our public outreach efforts that we've made thus far, to also provide a summary of our citizen survey, the results of that survey, and a brief project timeline for the overall plan development. The purpose of the citywide bicycle and pedestrian plan is to improve safety and mobility for pedestrians, cyclists, and also to our drivers, our motorists on the roadway. To provide connectivity across the city and the region. As we know, many cities across Hampton Roads also have bicycle plans. We don't want Portsmouth to be left out, and want to provide a continuous network between Portsmouth and those surrounding cities. This plan will also create a framework for active transportation within the city, and it also provide us with some guidelines for shared mobility, which will be brought up in the next presentation. So our vision is to create an active community where bicycling and walking are safe, healthy, and fun for all ages and abilities in Portsmouth. Now, the city of Portsmouth, as I've mentioned before, and you all are aware, has many advantages. Our flat terrain, mild temperatures. We have several historic walkable neighborhoods, growing bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. We're working on our rail to trail in the Churchland area, as well as bike lanes and sharrows that you've seen throughout other parts of the city. We've also been nationally recognized. We are a bicycle-friendly community, which has been updated for another 4 years, and we are working on being re-recognized as a walk-friendly community. But also, one of our key advantages is that we have a legacy of planning work that's been done that's mentioned the need for bicycle and pedestrian planning within the city, starting with our master transportation plan about a decade ago, which mentioned that. Our current recently approved comprehensive plan, Bill 1 Portsmouth, talks about it. The Crawford Corridor Revitalization Study, which talks about opening up the waterfront for more bicycle and pedestrian activity, that discusses it as well. Now, the citywide plan will talk about, will deliver key things such as a network connectivity map for our bicycle network, a complete streets policy. And if you all may or may not be familiar, complete streets is the idea that you can create a street that can accommodate all modes of transportation, whether you're driving, you're walking, you're biking, for all ages and abilities. Shared mobility analysis, which we'll go into in the next presentation, looking at e-scooters and bike share, and a bicycle advisory committee, which I will also talk about. And I guess which was mentioned in the beginning, we do have a project development team. Our lead consultant, Alta Planning and Design, a nationally renowned planning firm that has done lots of work in bicycle and pedestrian planning. They've also helped the city of Portsmouth as well before. They helped us to get our bicycle-friendly designation many years ago. We also have several key departments within the city that have formed our stakeholder committee, both planning and engineering, parks and rec, public health, police, schools. And we are trying to put together a citizens advisory committee. We had several volunteers from our recent public meeting that wanted to get more involved. These are residents, bicycle advocates, business owners, those that want to be a part of the process. They're also going to be helping us to develop this plan. So July 1st was our first community meeting, which we had up at the Churchland Branch Library. It was very well attended. I think we had over 30 people who were there, as well as city staff and consultants. In addition to listening to presentations, from the group, they also engaged in looking at maps, drawing possible bike routes, coming up with goals and objectives for the plan. So we got a lot of very useful information. City staff also attended several events in August, the Sunset Thursdays, which we had a table and we mentioned the plan to many people there, as well as the Seawall Art Show. We were present at that event and we were very visible. One of the ways we were able to pass out business cards, which is a part of the plan, advertising that we have a website, Portsmouth Bike and Pedestrian Plan.com, which is a site where citizens can find more information about the bicycle plan, and they can put in their comments as well. And I'll kind of show you, we have a bit of a graphic. It might be a little hard to look at, but on the website, in addition to finding out about the plan itself and how we're going with the plan, there's also an interactive map. That map, you can, on a computer, identify routes where you would like to bike or routes that you think are unsafe to bike. You could identify destinations. You could identify barriers in the community. All that information was recorded on our website. And the map is still active. It's no longer taking any inputs at this time, but any citizen can go and to see how citizens looked at Portsmouth as far as what's available. Are we really bike friendly and walk friendly based on citizens' input? So from that map and from the survey, we had 327 responses, 104 map inputs, which I showed you before, from across the city and various neighborhoods, even some surrounding cities as well, took an interest in what we're doing here in Portsmouth, so it was good to see that. As we suspected, the majority of residents currently are biking and walking, primarily as a means of exercise and recreation. What we found out is that they would like to be able to bike and walk for commuting and for shopping and other purposes as well too. So that was something important that we discovered. The survey also showed us that our top destinations include, of course, downtown Portsmouth, local parks, the city park in particular, restaurants. These are areas that people expressed a desire to have more connectivity to. Also, having a safe way in order to bike from Churchland to the downtown area, as well as something connecting the Jordan Bridge with Paradise Creek Park. These are some of the ideas that were explained in the survey. And working with our consultants, we also did a equity and safety analysis, basically identifying crashes that had taken place in the city, looking at infrastructure, existing bike and ped infrastructure, laying it out based on race and income throughout the city. From that, we realized that our highest need is within our lower income communities with limited transportation options. They mentioned issues of damaged sidewalk, lack of bicycle facilities, other physical barriers, such as the Interstate 264 and so forth, that prevent people from being able to bike as much as they would like to. And so our project schedule thus far, this fall we're analyzing survey results and developing a draft network map. Later on this winter, hopefully before the end of the year, we'll have a draft plan which will document some of the things that I've explained. We're hoping with this draft plan to have a second community meeting this spring. And then by summer, hope to have a plan for council to review and to take action on. And so with that, I'll take any questions.
Questions? Just one question in reference to the rail to trail through West Norfolk. Will that attach to Chesapeake and Suffolk where they have something similar and it'd be a one connected
Yes.
trail?
Absolutely, yeah. It's part of the regional Southampton Roads Trail, and Suffolk has done a portion from the driver's section to the Chesapeake line. Chesapeake has obtained a grant. They're going to be building their section. Our section starts right off of High Street and will continue to West Norfolk Road.
Okay. I was familiar with the train tracks. I just wanted to make sure that's where it was going.
Yes.
Thank you.
Questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
On August 27, 2019, members of City Council, you received an introduction and research information on the requirements for establishing a program regulating e-scooters and other shared mobility devices. Tonight, Deputy City Manager Bob Baldwin will provide an update, including the proposed pilot service area, proposed operating policies, anticipated dates for potential initiation of the service, and the final City Council actions required for approval of the pilot project. Mr. Baldwin.
As you come to the lectern, I remind primarily the public that may be looking at this that the state of Virginia enacted legislation that gives local governments only this year, to the end of this year, 2019, to adopt ordinances to regulate e-scooters. And if you don't, as a locality, enact such an ordinance, you use the ability to regulate. So there may be some who feel that this, we're inviting bikes. No, we're trying to, or not bikes, but scooters, we're trying to regulate their use and make sure that if they do come to Portsmouth, that everybody is safe. With that, Mr. Baldwin?
Thank you, and good evening, Mayor Rowe, Vice Mayor Lucas Burke, members of City Council. Again, this is a continuation of the discussion we had a couple of weeks ago, and we started talking, again, as the mayor just reminded you, on the action taken by the General Assembly at their 2019 session, and the requirement for us to do something about either creating a set of regulations or a pilot program to deal with the shared mobility things, which would include e-scooters, electric bicycles, and the like. So for tonight, we're going to continue that conversation we have as we move towards getting to the point of adopting a program. So we're going to discuss the staff's recommendation to you on the pilot program. The authorization, I just mentioned the way the General Assembly set up their requirement. The City Council is going to just adopt regulations by ordinance or by other means, a resolution, other means you can establish a pilot program. We're recommending, of course, starting off a pilot program to see how this works. I know there's been a lot of concerns and apprehension kind of mentioned about things people have read and heard about some of these scooters, for example. So we're trying to manage this through a pilot so we can assess how well that would work in Portsmouth. We're going to discuss the proposed service area. We'll talk about some of these regulatory elements and the permitting process we're talking about setting up to do the program. And then finally, a citizen survey and pilot program assessment, because as a pilot program, the intention would be to come back to council after it's been in place for a while with some results of the analysis and determining what you may want to do, expand, shrink, whatever the case may be. We have established time frame for the pilot program once it gets in effect. Again, we're knowing that we have to have the regulatory pieces in place, the pilot program in place before the end of the year. Our recommendation would be to be ready by January then to start accepting applications from firms who may want to set up these programs, with the idea being that they would be eligible to deploy their devices in March of 2020. And of course, at that point, the assessment of the program, the citizen survey begins, where people start to report back on what they're seeing, feeling, thoughts about that. October, in the fall, we would take the pilot program and our survey results and do our analysis, with the intent between October and the end of the year to be coming back to City Council to discuss it. And then so the City Council will be in a position by January of 2021, if you're that far out, but by January 2021, to assess the program and then what you might want to do, either make the program permanent, again, expand it, whatever the case may be. So that's the time frame we've recommended here for the pilot program. As we mentioned the last time we heard a couple of weeks ago, we talked about where to operate the pilot program. Mr. Jackson and others of us have been doing a fair amount of research and conversation with colleagues and other localities about what they're doing. This seemed like the logical place, a more dense place for people to be more interested in using scooters, for example. And we have got a proposed service area here for the pilot program, basically using Effingham and Port Center Parkway as the western boundary, moving back towards the waterfront with the concept of staying off the seawall. We discussed this the last time. Certainly if City Council wants scooters on the seawall, you could, certainly within your prerogative to do that. We're recommending not start off on the seawall right off the bat. And what we've done in these is we've gone north and south to tie in at the Naval Medical Center and at the shipyard. And while scooters aren't permitted on those facilities yet, in fact, the Navy is doing some pilot studies of their own about some of these alternative modes of transportation on military facilities. They are interested in the potential of their employees, whatever, having access to them perhaps outside of the gate if they wanted to go to lunch or do something like that. So we've had conversations. This seems to be a logical kind of a start off for the pilot program. At the last meeting, City Council was raising some concerns about some of the numbers we had proposed about the number of these devices to start off with. We've shrunken this back down based on that input. What we are recommending for the pilot is we would limit yourself to 2 companies. Each company with a limit of 125 devices, which would take you to a maximum number of 250 scooters. And we believe that's a good number for making a profit motive for the companies if you're going to try one of these out, that you don't have the number set so small that's not worth their effort to come. And also, you may not like one company or the other, so this gives you a chance to sort of compare different companies and how they provide service, the equipment they're using, things of that nature. They're not all the same as we hear, and so this will give you a chance to test them out in a pilot program. For the fee structure, the concept here is to make the, at least during the pilot program, self-supporting. We set the fee relatively high for a company at $5,000 and $1 a day per device. Constantly to generate enough money to hire a city program manager. What we hear from localities, I think I mentioned this in the last time, we get a lot of calls, especially early on these programs, from citizens. And while we would normally have, and will have the companies responsible for their own programs and operations, the public wants to call the city. They want somebody with the city to handle whatever the concern may be. And so we're going to likely have to look at having some sort of staffing level, both for enforcement and for responding to complaints or concerns, and for the interaction on a daily basis with the provider. So that's our concept. If you recall, we gave you that sheet the last meeting that compared to other localities. Feel free to look at that if you'd like to consider something else. But that's what we have. When we've taken a look at it, we would recommend that again for the idea of having these programs support themselves, starting off so the city's not subsidizing the expense of the pilot. Code amendments, definitely, some of these devices, as you know, the terminology is new. So the city's Department of Engineering and Technical Services is doing an assessment of city code and where some modifications will need to be made, some amendments done to incorporate some of this terminology, some of these rules and restrictions, update the code. So we have these 3 chapters. Our bicycles chapter, I think we've discussed this, the idea being that scooters, for example, would operate where bicycles operate. So we have to go into that section, motor vehicles and traffic and the street sidewalks and local improvements. We're also working with the police department as well as we work through some of these regulatory programs to make sure the regulatory pieces are in place. And the concept being that all of these code amendments will be brought before council during the course of the next few months, so they'll all be adopted before the end of the year and in advance of the pilot program being initiated. So the next steps we would get into will ultimately be approval of a resolution authorizing the pilot program, approval of the code amendments I just mentioned, and then we will be developing the citizen survey and the pilot program assessment over the few months after that. I believe you had put in your box a couple things today. It was more than we wanted to go through tonight, the full agenda you have, but we did provide you with a draft set of the regulations that have been proposed in there, and we are going to post these on the city planning department's webpage if others are interested in reading. Just, I think, 13 pages of this covers everything from insurance requirements to how the pilot program would operate and all of those things. So we want to get that covered. We've worked very closely with the city attorney's office. Jeff Miller in particular has worked very closely with Mr. Wright, Mr. Jackson, and I as we've been putting these things together. So this would be what would be attached when the resolution comes back up for council to adopt this program. If you look at the way this is structured as well, this would be authorizing the city manager to become basically the manager of the overall program for the pilot. And we also have developed an application. Did not share this with you. We do have an application form, so when these firms come in or enter, we've already developed the application form, so we're making pretty good progress here and getting ready for this pilot program for council. So with that's kind of where we are at this point. The next thing would be come back and we can discuss in more detail the regulations if you want to get more into that. But we will be intending to come back the next time before council, potentially by the end of October or your first meeting in November with the resolution to initiate the pilot program.
Elizabeth.
Bob, since I've never used one of these, explain to me how these companies, if they pay $5,000 for a permit and they have 125 units at $1 a day, that's about $22,000 for 6 months. So now they spent 27 something, almost $30,000, let's say, to operate for 6 months in the warmer weather. What do they charge to use?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Might see if Mr. Jackson
Trying to figure the
has,
profit model for them.
if you know what the fees are.
Well, like for Lime, for instance, which is one of the scooters that Norfolk uses, it's $1 just to start the scooter, and then 15 cents per minute.
It's an app on your phone.
It's an app. Once you start it, you already paid $1, and it's 15 cents for every minute that you use it. And then if you have that same scooter with multiple users throughout the day, they can generate a lot of money.
Thank you.
Your regulations, do they go in such detail as regulating the age of the scooter occupant?
Yes, and I believe our regulation is 18. You need to be 18. That doesn't mean you don't see people out in other places that are less than that, but our rules would state you need to be 18 years old to operate. And it's a single user per scooter, not carrying passengers with you. We do see that on occasion as well.
What about helmets?
Well, like most localities, helmets will be recommended but not required. When we have looked around, there's been almost no locality that has these scooters where then was, including bicycles, in fact, quite frankly, where we mandate adults wear helmets. This would be a similar setup where helmets would be recommended. We would work with the providers to make that an easy item to acquire for a user. But based on all the current research being done, almost no one riding a scooter will put on a helmet. So it's just...
I call it litter, scooter litter.
Right.
How do you regulate that?
Right, and that's the couple of parts we were talking about. Number one is we would have, as part of the agreement with the operator, their requirement to come in and retrieve, reset, make sure the scooters are back where they're, every morning back where they're supposed to start. As we would work with them during that January to March timeframe, we'd be looking at where the scooters would be placed and where they would be reestablished in the morning. If there's litter out there, back to what I just described, the intent would be to call the operator, their responsibility to pick the things up. But if it's in a bad location, if it's in a dangerous spot, something like that, we want to make sure the city is going to be in a position to retrieve it ourselves, if that were to be the case.
Elizabeth?
What about using the ferry back and forth between Norfolk and Portsmouth?
Right, and that's been a discussion. Norfolk is, they've got a single user operator over in Norfolk. We're going to be obviously having two. Our original concept that we mentioned the last one would be the geofence to lock the users within our program boundaries. Now we may determine over time there's some opportunity for localities to let people ride a scooter. Mr. Jackson just described they're not the cheapest thing to keep with you for long periods of time, but we would look at that as an alternative. Now each locality's got a different view of the scooters.
I see people taking it back and forth to work between the two cities.
And we have seen scooters from Norfolk, over here. I'm sure you probably have seen them by now, as well as their shared bikes as well. But the original intent would be to have the company, what they call geofences, so it shouldn't work when you get outside of our pilot area boundary. I'm not saying that that's 100% foolproof technology, but that's the idea is not to take the scooter out of Portsmouth. is we're going to have a pilot for 250 scooters in Portsmouth. We want 250 scooters, not 150, and you've taken the other 100 and gone to somewhere else.
Yeah, are there any requirements for us to choose, or whoever's choosing with the applicants that come in? Say we get 20 and we're only looking for 2.
Right, and that is one of the next things we're looking at. Obviously, we've got this concept of having 2 firms. We would have to have a selection process. We haven't gotten to the point of determining whether it's first come, first serve, or best. We're going to have some sort of a scoring criteria. That's part of what we'll look at, is to get back to that concept of limiting ourselves to 2. And for that, we'll also look at other localities that have done the same thing, that already have operating programs, and see how they set theirs up.
I'm sorry. One of the things, I know you said you're working with the police department on it, and that's one of the big issues, is a safety concern. This past weekend, I was in Nashville, and there were scooters everywhere. I will share with y'all later. I got a video. I believe it was no less than 10 of them riding in a pack going down the middle of the road. I saw several near crashes with vehicles, and I saw several that I believe were scooting under the influence. So there's a lot of problems with it. And I saw some, like we discussed before, near misses with pedestrians, and just like the mayor mentioned, the litter. I saw one that was broken apart, laying in the bushes. So I don't know if people were trying to steal the batteries out of them or what really was going on with that, but that's my biggest concern, is the safety, not just for the riders, but everybody else that's around these people riding these scooters.
And one of the things we haven't discussed, they mentioned the question of riding scooters at night. Our original intent is going to be not nighttime riding, although Norfolk allows it. They've got their scooters have lights, and I've been passed by scooters in Norfolk at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. There's also going to be a speed restriction. The state code says they can't go faster than 20. We're going to limit them to 15 in Portsmouth, just from seeing what they look like when they're going at high speed. Because they're quiet, we mentioned this before, because they're electric, they can be hazardous if you don't hear them coming. And so the proposal is to limit the speed to 15. And you're exactly right. I mean, looking at if the parks end up all over the place, hopefully that's not going to happen. Some of these localities you mentioned, they've been flooded by scooter operators. I think with our restricting our numbers, it's much more manageable, and that's part of this pilot. See if that's the right number. Maybe that's too many. That's what we'll have to look at. The other thing you have to look at, if you decide to expand in other parts of the city, what does that look like, and where would you want those? I think Norfolk is citywide. I think they have 900 scooters out in the Norfolk program.
Shannon.
Mr. Baldwin, maybe I may have missed this answer if provided, but my concern is really about risk and liability. From a city standpoint, who shoulders the risk? Who shoulders the liability?
Well, I can't speak. This may be more of an attorney question. I will say the way it's drafted, the concept is the liability is the provider's liability, with some protections back for the city in the event something. We know you're always a likely target of someone who wants to sue over an injury or whatever. But the idea is that the insurance requirements are being borne, the liability being carried by the provider.
Picking up on Shannon's question, and I share that concern too, safety and liability. The area that you show on the map is full of sidewalks, and some of those sidewalks have they're brick sidewalks, and they're quite old. They undulate because of roots. Are you proposing an outright prohibition of scooters on sidewalks?
Well, the program would say that. I will just, again, we'll tell you that there are going to be people on sidewalks. Other localities, answer your question, yes, we're proposing a ban on using scooters, other than to park them, perhaps, on the sidewalk. But what other localities have found is that in many cases, and this goes back actually to our bike and pedestrian program, when people who are on scooters don't feel like the street is safe, they'll take the refuge of the sidewalk, whether you want them up there or not. I think the Charlottesville program, they had 14% of their scooter riders say they prefer to be on the sidewalk because they were afraid to be in the street. So a lot of that gets into creating bike lanes where scooter operators are very pleased to be in a bike lane. They just don't like to be in that general flow of traffic, or at least it seems they're much more concerned with that.
One more question that might have already been addressed in your packet, but just piggybacking on what's been said, as far as our ordinances, when somebody has to use a smartphone to activate that scooter, is there a way that we can have those companies provide them when they activate that scooter with what our ordinances are? they would show on their phone. Whether they read them or not,
Yes.
that's up to them. But
Yes.
that way we can say, well, they had the rules.
They can
and knew
provide,
it.
they can provide the rules of operating the scooters as part of the opening of the scooter. And certainly look at all of those things, but yes, the idea is that the rules of the road be explained, so you don't just assume everyone knows.
Sure.
But then that doesn't mean they follow.
Oh, absolutely. But we did
yes,
our part.
The idea is
to-
we're going to try to do our part. We've also got, there may be some need to put some signage out. We haven't gotten to that part yet to do that. That'd be obviously something we work with the engineering technical services. We have made it clear, and we made it clear here that the operators can't put signs up, but the city certainly can get out because they're going to be operating in the city streets. And we want to keep them off the sidewalks. For example, keeping them off the seawall. No signs up on the seawall at this point. Looking at whether or not you'd need to do something like that to keep. The one time I got passed was up on the seawall. A guy passed me up there. So clearly, we'll take a look at all the regulatory pieces that go with that as well. And that's a part we'll be studying ourselves during the pilot.
Solomon,
Just one final question. I guess it's
final.
safety, risk, and the police. I've seen some people be really creative and they're riding their bikes in Portsmouth, riding them on the handlebars, or I saw somebody going sideways on the crossbar. So is there any way to offer any kind of citation or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what we would look at when we amend the code to make sure people understand the way these devices are intended to be used.
Right.
And what you're describing
Yeah,
is not it.
yes.
Solomon, if we follow this schedule and make these amendments, does it meet the requirement to have something in place by the end of the year? I think I know the answer.
Yes, Mayor. On the current schedule that Mr. Baldwin and his team has put together, we would be meeting the requirements from the General Assembly, and we would be in place in order to maintain our control over the scooter program or whatever process the council chooses to move forward with.
And yes, Elizabeth?
If we put all this in place, do these regulations also apply to Susie and Johnny that own their own private scooter?
Well, these are really intended to be applied to the companies that are setting up. However, the restrictions that'll go in the city code about using scooters would definitely apply to anyone.
Anybody?
Anyone.
I know the answer to this one, but I just want everybody to hear it that's listening and looking. Is the consensus of council to not close our eyes on this, but to take the necessary action?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Paul, you on board? Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Any further questions?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. One last thing before we adjourn. Last week, Shannon and I met with the president of the Waterview Civic League about utility billing, and I know that we've asked the city manager and the city attorney to look into that. Solomon, do you have a status report?
Mayor, Vice Mayor, members of City Council, for the last 6 months or so, the Public Utilities Department, in conjunction with the City Attorney's Office, has been preparing a revision of our water code to include references and making sure we're in compliance with both state law as well as best practices. The expectation is that you all will hear a presentation on the updates at, if not the next meeting, certainly by the first of the month.
Our practices, are they in conformity to current state law?
They are, and we are looking at some elements as it relates to other cities to see if there's some things we can tweak in terms of the updating of the code that might alleviate some situations that aren't expressly spelled out in our code today. We do have some practices that we put in place that aren't reflected in the code, and so we're going to try to make sure all of our practices are in fact reflected in the code and update and improve those where we need to.
All right, so our meeting in October. This concludes our business tonight. We'll adjourn and we'll convene for a work session tomorrow at 5 o'clock. This meeting is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you.